Certainly, Revelation is one of the most difficult, even probably one of the most weird books of the Bible, we might say. We don't use it as often as other parts of the New Testament, despite the fact that Revelation has actually been the readings throughout the entire Easter season, lectionary-wise. I imagine a lot of preachers have shied away from using Revelation. We don't really dabble in it for leisure reading. We certainly don't put images from it in young readers' Bibles. Because most of this book is a mixture of creatures, battles, symbols, horsemen, dragons, beasts from the seas, beasts in the air, lakes of burning sulfur, mouths with swords coming out of them. It is not perhaps the most comforting book when we first think about Revelation. And yet, the book of Revelation has had a pretty profound impact on Western culture if you stop and think about it. It's one of the most widely illustrated books of the Bible. It's depicted in architecture and tapestries, and there's paintings, and there's altar pieces. In the poetry of Dante and John Bunyan and William Blake and T.S. Eliot. It's in novels by Charlotte Bronte and Ray Bradbury. Handel wrote about it in his famous piece, The Messiah. And there's references to it in Julia Ward Howe's hymn that we'll sing later to close our service, Battle Hymn of the Republic. Many commentators assert that Revelation tells of the unveiling of what the end times are going to look like, the apocalypse. And apocalyptic themes pervade popular culture today. I mean, think about it. We're always wondering, right, as a culture, what will the last days look like? There's an incredibly popular series called Left Behind by Timothy LaHaye and Jerry Jenkins. It seems like consumers can't get enough of wondering what the end might look like. Timothy Luke Johnson is a scholar of the New Testament that I read a lot in seminary, and he says that few writings have been so obsessively read with such generally disastrous results as Revelation. Because sadly, Revelation, the book of, has been interpreted pretty wrongly for a good long while. It's been used to scare, it's been used to invoke fear, it's been used to abuse people into following a certain doctrine or way. But I believe that Revelation holds some comfort and a calling for you and I both today. Because Revelation does two pretty important things, I think. One, it reminds us that the world can be a pretty scary place. See, Revelation was written in the 1st century, which was a scary time for followers of Jesus. It's in the form of a letter. John, who is exiled on the island Patmos, is writing to Christians in the early church. They're still part of the Roman Empire, and many Romans were starting to see these followers of Jesus as being disloyal, unpatriotic even, because some refused to worship the emperor. Some were being imprisoned, tortured, executed. Many Christians, however, succumbed to the temptation simply to accommodate themselves to the powers that be. In the midst of such problem, the letter of Revelation comes in, not to foretell of the end times, but to unveil truth about God's presence with these people as they faced the unimaginable. We too live in scary times. For the last 2 years, we've tried to make sense of a global pandemic. And in the last 10 days, we've lost precious lives. Unemployment is up. I feel it every time my family goes to the grocery store or to the gas tank. It's not an easy time. When we turn on the news, we see that things are still wrong across the world, especially in Ukraine, as innocent people are being sacrificed there. We live in a scary time. You know all the problems. I could spend time with you today listing them, but I'd rather sit in some hope with you. We who call ourselves conscientious Christians must be aware that sometimes our religion gets in the way of offering love and grace to a wounded world. I know it has for me before. One of the problems with us deeply religious people is that sometimes we get so clear in our convictions that we try to mow down anyone else in our way who doesn't see it like we do. We live in a scary world, so no wonder we're drawn to apocalyptic visions. No wonder we wonder about how it's all going to come to an end. You know, REM wrote a song many years ago, "It's the End of the World as We Know It." And I always wondered, why do they feel fine? That's the refrain. It's the end of the world as we know it, and I feel fine. Well, if the world that you and I live in right now is ending, the one that we know as it is right now, I feel fine too. Because you and I, and all of us, have been glorifying in some of the wrong stuff, folks. Ignoring, neglecting, consuming goods that possess us rather than us possessing them, going through motions of religion rather than actually practicing spiritual disciplines that help us live prayerfully, humiliating our adversaries, engaging in war, shaming the immigrant. If that stuff's ending, then I do feel fine. The second reason that the book of Revelation, I think, remains a profoundly powerful text is that it acknowledges the hardship and suffering of daily existence while it also invokes the deepest longings of our heart for life, full, healed. In my work at Church of the Resurrection as the Silverlink pastor, I end up doing quite a few funerals, as you can imagine, since the population I serve is well into their 80s and 90s, sometimes 100-year-olds. And every funeral I do, I choose at some point to read the words that Jesus says in John 14 to his disciples. "Those who love me will keep my word, and my Father will love them, and we will come to them and make our home with them." Eugene Peterson wrote a version of the Bible called The Message many years ago, and I always like the way he puts this. He says, God will move right into the neighborhood. God shares the neighborhood with us, but only if we choose to live in that neighborhood. "Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not let them be afraid," Jesus says in John 14. Christ is with us, even in the scary times. And this passage from Revelation 21 and 22 that Christy did a beautiful job of reading offers us a similar choice this morning. Throughout the book, Babylon serves as a primary symbol for the Roman Empire. Injustice, violence, oppression. The invitation for you and I is to move out of that city and into New Jerusalem. There's not even a need for a temple in that city because God's presence permeates everything. The gates are always open and the gifts of creation are abundantly available to all. The tree of life is planted on each side of the river of the water of life, and it produces 12 kinds of fruit. And the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. The only way to be excluded from this city is to choose falsehood and deceit, which by definition do not belong to the city of God. Things like kindness and justice and truth and grace and love. What a vision. We speak of it every time we say the Lord's Prayer together on a Sunday morning. We just did so together a while ago. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, right now and right here. Those of us who know the saving grace of Jesus Christ need desperately to live out our belief that God intends to reclaim, restore, and redeem all. If ever there was a time when the world needs healing, it is now. And this new beautiful city of God is not just about this pie in the sky thing when we die. This vision is about a wonderfully delicious piece of pie that we can have on earth now. A life that basks in God's presence, a life that keeps God's commandment to love one another. God has moved into the neighborhood. Revelation is a powerful book of the Bible precisely because in the midst of our anxiety and our fear and our hopelessness, anybody ever feel any of those feelings in the last week or two? Our dreams for a future life with God break into the present reality. Revelation assures us that good will overcome evil, that love will overcome hate, that hope will overcome despair, and that life will overcome death. So, I leave you with this question this morning. In the last week or so, as we've tried to make sense of what happened in Buffalo and what happened in Texas and what continues to happen, in your response to those things, is there any tangible and plain proof that God has moved into your neighborhood? Does God's glory, the weighty, powerful, radiant presence of love, grace, healing, and wholeness shine out from your heart, your house, your church? We must choose every day to demonstrate concretely and visibly our love for Christ, for each other, and for the well-being of our communities. When we do, we actively choose to live in the grace of the city of God that embodies the fullness of God's hope for the world and for lives grounded in love, and to feel fine that this is the end of the world as we know it. Thanks be to God. Amen.